really not good wins instead. I'm not comfortable with that as an alternative outcome. So imagine that something really incomprehensible is happening to you. You can't believe it. You have no place in your conceptual structure to account for that. And so you feel as if it's not real. That's what derealization means. It means this isn't my life. You're separated from it. It's because you can't comprehend it. Well, every time I wake up, it's like I wake up and then it hits me that all this is happening.
I am truly thrilled to bring this man up here. He is at the center, right in the center, not just the center. He is at the center of the center.
Here, we can do this. Are we recording again? So this is what I actually look like, and then this is what people who don't like me think I look like.
And he's a good friend of mine, and I'm thrilled to bring up Dr. Jordan Peterson. Everybody.
Have you ever seen the magic glasses that can see clearly without glasses? These glasses can not only see far away, but also see...
Which one is real? Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I would say they're both real.
How much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly to guys the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work and say, I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
You've sold 2 million copies of 12 Rules for Life. You have 800,000 followers on Twitter, 1.4 million followers on YouTube. What is it that you're selling that so many people want to buy?
I don't think I'm selling anything.
Well, I went to a show where you were selling tickets to your show, so people are willing to pay a lot of money to see you speak. You know, what is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges, freedom and impulsive pleasure. Those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good, because if people are moored shallowly, then storms wreck them, and storms come along. So I'm talking to people about how they can build a foundation underneath them that works, and people need to know that, because otherwise their lives are harder than they need to be.
What is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion, and it's grounded in my clinical knowledge. So I've been a clinician for a very long time, and I'm familiar with the works of most of the great 20th century clinicians and a reasonable amount of philosophy and a good swath of literature. And I'm a credible scientist, and so I can bring that all together. And I've tried to bring it all together and to make a case for the significance of individual life and the psychological necessity of courage and nobility and responsibility, these things that sound old-fashioned, but are old-fashioned in the best sense. They're old-fashioned because they've lasted forever and they're absolutely necessary. And people need a call to responsibility because they need to mature. They need to want to be adults. And I don't think we do a very good job in our culture of making a case for why it's a good thing to be an adult.
And two things really made you famous, which is, first of all, is the book, 12 Rules for Life. The second one, I think, was an interview that went viral with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News, which you talked about men and women.
Podcasts help plenty.
All right, he's got a big, big following. But that was, I think, really fascinating, that interview, because it was specifically about men and women. And you said at the time, YouTube skews very male, and your fan base is very male. Is that still the case? Are you still primarily talking to men?
I would say the talks are probably 60-40, 65-35 male to female. The book sales, I don't know. I doubt it because usually it's women who buy books, although men do buy nonfiction if they buy books. We don't know the demographics on the books. But the book has definitely expanded my audience, I would say. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I never set out specifically to talk to men. My students for most years at university have been primarily female. I think most of my graduate students have been female. It might be about 50-50, but I think it would probably tilt more in the direction of female. So it wasn't something I set out to do. I think though that, as I said earlier, well, I can't tell how much of it is merely a consequence of the fact that YouTube skews so male. It might also be something to do with how to take on voluntary responsibility. I'm not exactly sure why that would be more necessary for men right now. I think it might be because our culture confuses men's desire for achievement and competence with the patriarchal desire for tyrannical power. And that's a big mistake. Those aren't the same thing, even a bit. So, and it's very inappropriate psychologically and sociologically to confuse them. So,
well, one of the things I want to come back to is this idea. So that you say in the book, there is masculine order and feminine chaos.
No, actually, I say that those are symbolic representations of the two things.
Right, okay. So why? Why is order masculine?
I think it's because our primary social hierarchy structures are fundamentally masculine.
And that's not the patriarchy?
Well, it's not the modern idea of the patriarchy, that's for sure.
I mean, so that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
In what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected of men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most men.
Me lo cogí ahí en la esquina.
Wars are men. People who do wars
Literalmente me lo cogí.
men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. Terrible things happen to people of both sexes.
And you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy.
Well,
it just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence.
Well, yes, there's an asymmetry in all sorts of places, but that doesn't mean that Western culture is a male-dominated patriarchy. The fact that there are asymmetries has nothing to do with your basic argument.
No, but you might
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. And it's the case with almost every interaction that you have at the face of our culture. You're dealing with people who are offering a service of one form or another, who who are usually part of the broad middle class, and who offer, and what you're looking for is the person who can offer the best service, and you can find it. It's not a consequence of being dominated by anything that's tyrannical. And then again, a culture, a Western culture, which is by no means perfect, and certainly has tyrannical elements like all cultures do, is the least tyrannical society that's ever been produced, and certainly the least tyrannical society that exists now. So where's the patriarchy exactly in all of this?
Well, saying that it's the least tyrannical society is not the same as saying it's not a tyrannical society.
That's exactly why I said it was the least tyrannical.
But that's what I mean. So you haven't debunked the existence of patriarchy then. You've said that actually now is better for women.
Demonstrate its existence.
Okay, well, let's go through it. I'm writing a book about feminism in the moment. Until 1919, there were professions that women were barred from. They simply were not allowed to do it. Until 1880s.
Why would you blame men for that?
Because who was in those professions? Who was guarding entry to those professions? Who was worried about losing their status if women became doctors? Well, a couple of different things. I think it was technology. I think it was the pill helped enormously because it gave people one in the 60s.
Right, so that wasn't 1919.
No, but I also think it was a series of legal changes that started in Britain with the Married Women's Property Act, which said for the first time women are full legal beings under the law. They can own property. And that to me is a structure that has continued throughout, from a time when women didn't have the same legal rights as men to now when they mostly do, but culture still lags behind it. I don't think you and I are necessarily talking at such cross purposes. It's just that your conception of patriarchy, as I see it in the book, is that quite a lot of men are quite nice and they do nice things for women. And
no, that's not my conception of patriarchy. I don't require men or advise them to be nice.
Well, you do talk about the guy who's the tampon king, the sanitary towel king of India, right?
I wouldn't call that nice.
Okay,
well, I call that brave.
Okay.
Did you read about his life when he was trying to develop that?
Yeah.
God, it was absolutely miserable, and he did it anyways. He freed all sorts of women as a consequence.
And I think that was
nice. That's courageous. That's noble. That's visionary. It's not nice.
I think it is also nice. I think it is also something that is, it is honouring your social obligations.
I'm not so sure that that's a social obligation, because many other people would have done it had it been a social obligation. He said what he was concerned about. He saw that his wife was suffering with her monthly period and had to choose between feeding her family and taking care of herself properly, and chose to feed her family and thought he would do something about that. That goes way past nice, especially given what he had to suffer through to do all the experimentation that produced his eventual technology. So, this whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't. I really don't.
Throughout history, have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. A terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children, with all the death that was associated with that. And to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy is an absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
I mean, I absolutely disagree with you. I think that's like saying slavery in the US was actually, most people cooperate. Well, no, you didn't. You had a system where one set of people owned another set of people. And until women got full legal rights, they could own property for themselves, they could work. Essentially, they were owned. They were first owned by their fathers and then by their husbands.
To the domination by men.
Yeah.
You said that you thought that what emancipated women primarily in the 20th century was technological revolution.
No, not primarily, but that's one of two. I think there's two things.
Primarily, eh?
No.
I think the pill was a primary force in the emancipation of women.
I think
the invention of tampons, let's say, or the provision of proper sanitary facilities, toilets, and that sort of thing. You're thinking instead it was the action of courageous feminists in the 1920s that produced the social revolution that overthrew the patriarchy. That's your theory.
Yeah, I think
that's a foolish theory.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear you say that, but I think to quote you in the Kathy Newman interview, I think it's a multivariate, right? I think there are lots of different things that all contributed to whether
let's not be assuming that Western society was a tyrannical patriarchy.
Well, no, that's one of them, and then other things happened as well. So you have the pill, you have the dishwasher and white goods, the labour-saving devices in the home. I think all of those are really important. But you also have things like campaigns for the vote.
Yes, you also have things like that, yes.
So how, when in a system that existed in England until 1918, when...
Why would you even want to look at history like that? What's your goal?
Because I think the people who don't look at history are condemned to repeat it, and I think that we are...
What are we going to do? Repeat the persecution of women? Do you think that's a realistic possibility?
Yeah, we're sitting here...
How do you see that?
We're sitting here in America, right, where we've just had a fifth judge appointed to the Supreme Court who is now anti-abortion, is now conservative. I think that abortion rights are absolutely fundamental to women being able to function as full humans in society, and I think that is now under threat in America. I think it is extremely smug and complacent to think civilization has peaked, it's all upwards from here.
Yeah, well, good luck with that.
It's a living. There are lots of people who agree with me, there are lots of people clearly who agree with you. I'm going to...
There are just a lot of people, I would say, who are coming to listen to what I say because they're sick and tired of having their desire to move forward in the world and to achieve something and to take their place as adult males, let's say, who are under the weight of accusations that their ambition and forthrightness is a manifestation of something that's fundamentally tyrannical. They're not happy with that. It's not doing anyone any good, and it's also not true. It's really a terrible thing to do to young men. And it's happening all the time. That's why they're bailing out of universities like mad. There won't be a man left in the social sciences in 10 years in the universities, and it's no bloody wonder. It's an unhospitable place. And it's unhospitable precisely because of this doctrine. It said that throughout history, the fundamental relationship between men and women was one of power, essentially slavery. It's like, fine, believe it if you want. It's not going to do your relationships any good, I can tell you that. So.
Okay, well, we'll see how that one goes. I'm currently married, but I'll raise it with him. I think the university example is a really fascinating one because you talk in the book about the fact that now women are a majority on 2/3 of college courses in the US. And I've also seen you saying you believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. Maybe
It isn't only that I don't believe in equality of outcome. I think it's an unbelievable pathological wish and doctrine.
Right,
it's
but
very dangerous. History has demonstrated exactly how dangerous it is. Equality of opportunity is something that anyone with any sense would support. But equality of outcome, it's...
So what's your problem with there not being...
beyond belief to support equality of outcome.
Okay, so what's your problem with there not being enough men in the social sciences? Perhaps women are just cleverer. Perhaps that's why there are more women at university, right? Under your doctrine. I don't think that, but that's the logical extension of your doctrine.
Isn't the fact that there's an unequal distribution. The problem I have with it is that the reason that men are bailing out is because of the prevalence of the doctrine that you're espousing. That's the problem I have with it. It doesn't matter that much. They will bail out. I don't see any way that the universities are going to redeem themselves in the next decade. So, and maybe that will be fine. But I doubt it.
That seems extremely pessimistic when the number of people going to university just generally are going up.
Yeah, well, that's not going to last for very long.
Why not?
Because it's too expensive and the universities are doing all sorts of things that aren't acceptable. Mostly racking up the price. So, and decreasing the quality of what they're offering and playing into the hands of the people who are ideological acolytes of the identity politics routines and playing postmodern stunts and pushing neo-Marxism and all these things that are characteristic of the social sciences and the humanities primarily.
See, this is where I find you fascinating to me because, you talk in these quite apocalyptic terms. I think that, someone will listen to that and think, wow, there's a really big problem. But what we're really talking about is some irritatingly postmodern professors and some students with blue hair and funny ideas about gender in a handful of courses around America and West Europe.
If that's what we're talking about, no one would have paid attention to me for more than about 15 minutes. So you might see this as some surface manifestation that's irrelevant, but that isn't how most people view it. It's certainly the case, too, that this identity politics battle of ideas was a determining factor in the last American election. If Hillary would have played identity politics, played cozy with the identity politics type, she would have kept the working class and she would be president now. So these aren't trivial issues by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just some kids having a decent time while they're being creatively rebellious at university. It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to are predicated on, well, one assumption they're predicated on, it's probably the primary assumption is that the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous, and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created. You know, I was reading about some Indonesians.
Do you mean me as a woman or me as a
I mean
21st
us.
century person in the world?
I mean, us, yeah.
I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the
Then how
project
is
of
it
politics
a
is...
construction of a tyrannical patriarchy? You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
progressive
That's a perfectly
means.
reasonable proposition.
But I guess
that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of the tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good, and yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family. Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Oh well, fair enough. But if
you could trade it off with someone who's less privileged. That'd be a start.
I could do that, but I don't want to, and I won't, and I don't think I should be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay for you to occupy a position of privilege in the patriarchal tyranny? And if it is it because you're female, or is it just because it's convenient?
Let me tell you my political philosophy. I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, that the New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich.
Define filthy rich.
Well, I think I would leave that
You're probably in the top 1/10 of 1% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not sure that I'm going to
line exactly?
Be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forward, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life...
civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
It's not purely a tyrannical patriarchy,
That's for sure.
Is it?
It's purely not. Right. And that's exactly the issue.
But why would you deal with moral
ambiguity? When you describe it as a tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that, and that's exactly what's ungrateful.
Why?
It's not purely that at all.
Why is saying that something has elements of this make it the same as it is purely that?
That isn't what's being said. Merely to define it as a patriarchy implies unidimensionality, and to insist that that's also tyrannical doesn't offer a balanced viewpoint at all.
Well, I think that's probably where your disagreement comes with this, which is because I do not see it in that way. I do not see it as univariate at all. I see it as one.
Then why call it patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it? And what if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated classes, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatized, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. They kind of reel back. We all make those implicit associations. So
if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way of, they should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too. Yeah, definitely feeling left out
too. So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women, then it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy. We're kind of out of options.
Correct, but, or you could have an office in which a blend of people of both sexes work.
So if it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
I'm saying that there is clearly, when there's only 15% of male primary school teachers, they do feel marginalised and excluded. So
you think the defining hallmark of a tyrannical social structure is the predominance of one gender, and if that was relatively equalized, then all of a sudden it would be a free and open institution?
I don't think that male primary school teachers are being tyrannised. I do think they are being marginalised, and I do think that they feel excluded and stressed.
So what do you do about that?
Well, this is what I mean. I think actually, and I'm surprised you don't agree with me on this, that actually having more male primary school teachers would be a really good thing, because boys need role models, actually, particularly boys who don't have a father figure in their life. That's really important for them to have a stable adult who shows them what it's like to be a man around the place.
Could be, but you shouldn't achieve it as a consequence of preferential hiring.
No, I don't think it would necessarily need to be preferential hiring. I think it would probably be about making that job, breaking down the stigma for entering that job. I think teaching is a really interesting example that we've seen at the turn. Right. And how did that make you feel?
I loved it.
Yeah.
You know, the kids, I used to wrestle with the kids, which girls can't do now because everybody knows that would just be a catastrophe. You know, I used to draw them pictures of monsters and they'd line up for that. And I liked the kids quite a lot. And I didn't care whether they were just female dominated. I've been female dominated my professions my whole life.
Right, I think...
I felt marginalized as a consequence.
Oh, then you have been lucky, and I have talked to people who have the opposite.
Might be careful to conduct as well.
Explain that more to me?
Now, why would you assume that it would be luck?
Well, if I say that, there is a statistical analysis and I talk to a broad range of people and, you would always expect outliers at either end. Some people have had a really terrible time, some people have had a really brilliant time, and everybody else in the middle.
That I strive to do is not to become resentful.
Well, okay, that's very good. I have to say that your Twitter feed does not give me that impression. You come across as somebody who takes criticism very much to heart. Is that true?
I don't think you have any grounds for that suggestion. I mean, you see my interviews online. If I was someone who took criticism at heart, I'd be in a lot more trouble than I am now.
In what way?
Well, I've been criticized endlessly for 2 years. I've been in scandals. I've probably been in, I don't know how many scandals in the last 2 years. I had unbelievably contentious interviews with journalists online, on TV, on radio, and podcasts. If I was someone who couldn't tolerate criticism, the evidence for that would already be clear. Twitter is a strange social network. I've kind of pulled myself away from it. So it's not an easy place to conduct yourself with as much grace as you might. And I think it sort of rewards impulsivity because maybe it's because of the constraint on characters or something like that. So I think that people tend to show their worst on Twitter, and some of that's a consequence of the structure of the technology.
I think I certainly agree with you. I think there's something that we agree on there. I think people are really...
¿Quién es, boludo? Me distraen, man. ¿Quién entró?
Their best on Twitter.
No, and I've pulled myself away from it quite a lot in the last month, mostly to see. I kind of kept an eye on Twitter, all the social media networks for the last few years, partly to see. Well, I'm trying to monitor what's happening around me, I suppose, is probably the right way of thinking about it, to see if I'm making mistakes and how they might be rectified. But I don't think Twitter's real good for me, and I don't think the reply function on Twitter is useful, and I think the fact that so many people on Twitter are anonymous is not a good thing at all.
Do you think you'd be less angry if you weren't on Twitter? That's something I think quite a lot. I would be coming into contact with less things that annoyed me on a daily basis.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah. I think that's definitely the case. And I've talked to other people who pulled back from Twitter and experienced the same thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about Twitter.
¡La puta!
Heightened the desire of people to be provocative. And maybe it's the case that only people who are irritable respond. We don't know. Like if you put up a post and 1,000 people read it, certainly people won't respond. A few people respond. Well, maybe it skews way over to those people who had a bad day. That's what
Sí, muy bien lo que tengo que hacer, boludo, pero golpear así, justo cuando está metiendo patadas, justo el poder que tengo, no tengo nada para cubrirme, man.
Plus, you're interacting with random strangers, which is something you never ever do, and it's never the same set of random strangers. And you don't react to Twitter like it's random strangers. You react to Twitter like it's a person that you know, and it isn't.
You write in 12 Rules for Life about violent impulses that you didn't act on, and I think in Maps of Meaning you sort of elaborate on that. You say you fantasize about stabbing a classmate in the neck, and you seem like you're very clear about the fact that you never ever thought you would take those seriously. But it just does make me think that
No le hago daño así.
somebody who thrives on anger and finds anger to be something that they need in their life, that they find motivates them to do the things that they need to do.
Those are two different questions.
Okay, you can answer them both.
One is whether I thrive on it.
Si no, bueno, está, boludo. Cada uno juega solo, man.
So I actually don't like conflict. It's
Then
really
how
hard
have you
on me.
ended up doing this as a job? Which is arguing with people, right?
Just because no, that's not my job. It's not to argue with people.
Okay.
So my job is to not do things that I don't think I should do. Right, and my government made the mistake of assuming that compelled speech was acceptable as long as it was motivated by hypothetical compassion. And that's not happened for me. So I made that point. It wasn't because I wanted to or because I enjoyed it. I don't really like conflict. I'm actually a rather agreeable person, which is partly why I'm a clinician. And so I find the constant conflict exhausting. But that's not the issue. And you're not morally obligated. You're morally obligated to do things other than that which you like. So now I really do enjoy the lecture series that I'm doing. And the reason for that is that it's not political in its essence. I'm trying to do everything I can to bring people who are trying to develop a vision for their life together and to encourage them to act more responsibly, but not in a finger-wagging sort of way, but because I've come to understand that the meaning that sustains you in life is mostly to be found through responsibility. And
Es práctica, man.
voluntary adoption of responsibility, you're very likely to find your fundamental strength. And I think that that's clinically unassailable observation. And that's all very good, and I'm very pleased to be doing it, and it seems to be having a salutary effect as far as I can tell. And but it's not because I thrive on anger. I mean, you were at my show,
On Thursday night, yeah.
How much anger was there in that?
Well, I thought it was fascinating because it was in Long Island. We drove to it and we went past a Lamborghini dealership, a Porsche dealership. This is not a poor area. The audience was, I would say, very, as I was surprised how many women there. It was pretty mixed. It was overwhelmingly white. And I thought you talked, and you said at the end, I was more incoherent than I normally am. You ranged across quite a range of subjects from, status in monkeys to perception. But the things that the crowd clapped and they applauded were when you went, oh, you can't say that, that's a microaggression. Or multiculturalism is a scourge that is sweeping Canada. And what I got was a strong sense...
That has swept Canada.
Okay. Well, what I got was a very strong sense of people whose lives...
I never said that it was a scourge that swept Canada either. I wouldn't have said that.
Okay, well, I will go back and check your exact wording, what you said, but you definitely...
I'm not in favor of it as a fundamental doctrine.
Right, okay,
but I don't think it's a scourge.
So I wonder if you and I mean the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, because you have a First Nations room in your house, right? You have a lot of First Nations stuff. How is the coexistence of...
Honorary member of a First Nations family.
Well, I have a First Nations artist when I went to Canada last year. But that to me is the essence of Canadian multiculturalism, that culture being preserved and living alongside the Anglophone culture that in some sense has supplanted it. How is that not multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. That's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world. And the world is full of war. So how can that possibly work? If you're going to bring people together and they're going to exist together in harmony, they have to be playing a game that everyone plays, that everyone knows the rules for. It can't be 10 different sets of rules for different people. How's it going to work? So it's absolutely naive to believe how. If that worked, the world wouldn't be full of war.
Well, before we had, multiculturalism, we still did have war. Well, in fact, war is, as Stephen Pinker, I'm sure you read your Stephen Pinker says, this is the least violent time in human history. So
yes,
something is working.
Well,
so if you think the patriarchy's been eroded over the last 100 years, maybe that's what it's down to. Maybe we could give some credit to it for that.
I actually didn't say that the patriarchy would be eroded.
Well, because you don't believe it existed in the first place, fair enough. But my definition of multiculturalism is citizenship-based, right? So you can be both Canadian and First Nations. You can be both Quebecois and also Canadian.
But that means that everybody in the multicultural milieu is one thing and another.
Right.
They're all one thing and another.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, our
That's
Prime Minister said, well, there is no Canadian identity. It's like, well, okay, what is it that unites us? Well, nothing. We all protect our cultures. It's like, well, that leads to war.
Okay,
That doesn't only lead to war, obviously. But unless you have people operating within a shared framework of perception and value, they can't cooperate and compete peacefully. I don't understand how that's even a disputable topic. That's how you organize people.
Okay, I think if that's what he said, that's what Trudeau said, that is a dumb thing for the Prime Minister of Canada to say when you are Prime Minister of Canada.
You might say that.
I would agree much more with what Barack Obama said when he said, I'm trying not to make a red states America or blue states America or white America, black America. I'm trying to make a United States America. That to me is...
the Democrats are very good at that.
Well, they
They've
tried...
played identity politics for the last 20 years. All they've done is inflame tribal tendencies, as far as I can tell. So he can say that, but it isn't obvious that it's the case. And it's not obvious to me at all that one of the consequences of Barack Obama's presidency was a reduction in racial tension in the United States.
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. I think a lot of people found having a black college-educated professor very alarming and threatening to their idea of themselves as the dominant group.
To stop them from voting for him twice.
No, that is very true. But again...
It's fundamentally true, right? It's really the crucial issue at hand here.
No, but he built a big coalition of white, well-educated liberals and people of colour. I mean, that is the Democrat electoral...
Well, how do you explain the rise of racial tension in the United States, then?
Well, I think it's caused by a lot of things, not least of one of which is the Republican Party inflaming it. You talk about the left playing identity politics. I think the right play identity politics all the time.
The right doesn't dominate the universities.
No, but it dominates... But Donald Trump is president, so realistically...
Donald Trump is hardly a typical Republican.
No, I would say that he accomplished...
In fact, for most of his life, if I remember correctly, he was a Democrat.
Right, I don't think he has any political...
So we're not going to blame Donald Trump
allegiance
on the right
to...
wing.
Okay, but I'm going to say the rest of the Republican Party are also quite happy to play, I would say, white identity politics. They did not dump him as their candidate when he said, Mexicans, they're not sending us their best people here, they're rapists, right? The whole idea of the United States, it said, I think a beautiful thing, all men are created equal, but it meant men, and it meant specifically white men. Women and black people could not vote. The US was founded on identity politics. This is not some new concept that has come along in the last 20 years.
The United States wasn't founded on identity politics.
Yes, it was.
That's absolutely absurd proposition. The United States was founded on the same principles that, what would you say, that played their powerful role through the development of English democracy, and that was nested inside a Judeo-Christian view that fundamentally presumed that both men and women were made in the image of God and that all people had divine value. And it took a long time for that set of ideas to fully manifest itself in the political realm, but to consider that a manifestation of identity politics is I can't imagine why you would possibly do that.
I don't consider that a manifestation of identity politics. I consider having a constitution that says only some people are citizens to be a manifestation of identity politics.
Well, what do you think changed it across time? And look, let's get our definitions straight here. You can't lump all occurrences of non-equal treatment into the category of identity politics. Identity politics is a very specific thing. It's really only existed since the 1970s. You can't go back into 1770 and say that the founders of the American Constitution were playing identity politics.
They were playing politics that was based on identity. That's my definition of identity
politics. That's not the definition of identity politics unless you play fast and loose with the definition. Identity politics is something that's no one talked about identity politics 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's a new term. You can't say that people's proclivity to identify with their group is identity politics. That's just tribalism. And that's like, who knows how old that is? 1 million years old. 500,000 years old. And you're going to call tribalism identity politics? Well, that's not helpful. If you want to talk about tribalism, we could talk about tribalism. But identity politics is something that's nested inside of a particular political view of the world. It's It's got a Marxist basis, and it manifests itself in postmodernism. And it emerged in the American France first in the 1970s, and then has swept through the American universities, and increasingly the rest of the West since then. That's identity politics. If you want to talk about tribalism, that's fine. I'm not a fan of tribalism, which is why I don't like the identity politics types. And I don't care if they're on the right or the left. I think the right-wing use of identity as the primary marker for human categorization is as reprehensible and dangerous as it is on the left. My problem with the left at the moment, the fundamental problem with the radical left, is that they're hyper-dominant in academia. And that's not good. And that's not my opinion. You can go look at Jonathan Haidt's dad and see for yourself that he's as modern a person as you could hope to find, and probably less prone to anger than me.
And I agree with you. I find a lot of students phenomenally irritating, but I would question how much power they have in contrast to the things that I find more worrying happening in the world today, right? Or even the professors, right? Even
the 20-year-olds don't have that much power, but they're not 20 forever. 10 years later, they're 30. And 20 years later, they're 40.
Right.
And whatever happens in the university happens everywhere 5 years later.
And very, very sadly for people in my politics, left-wing politics, what happens to people as they get older is that they've traditionally got more conservative. So I don't think you can make a case that the current, what some people are when they're 20 today is actually going to be the ideology that takes them all the way through their life. That's never been the case.
It'll be around long enough to do plenty of damage, like it already is.
Okay, but even if we accept that students and their co-mo professors are quite annoying, which I think is probably something I agree with.
They're not just annoying. Like, they're destroying the universities, and that's not a good thing. And they're particularly destroying the social sciences and the humanities. The sciences are safe so far, but not for long. Because the scientists in particular are terrible at politics, and the left-wing activists are great at politics. And so they'll win eventually. The National Science Foundation is already introducing diversity requirements for hiring in mathematics in universities. So good luck with that. That's not going to work. There are hardly any mathematical geniuses. You start putting all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on their hiring, you're just going to end up not finding the ones that there are. So, besides,
I don't think that's true, actually, because I mean, if you say there are very few mathematical geniuses, well, next year I'm going to be a fellow at Oxford University, so I spend time talking to academics. I've talked to a lot of academics for my book. I do agree with you, there is an individual strain that is sweeping through a lot of universities. I don't think it's an existential threat, and I certainly don't think it is, to me, the biggest issue in world politics today. It's the one that I would choose personally.
What do you think is the biggest issue?
I think that the rise of strongmen, authoritarians around the world is very worrying, and that's one of the reasons that I find the subtitle of your book fascinating, because it's called An Antidote to Chaos. Why isn't it an antidote to order, which you also say in its excessive manifestations is bad?
I've said that. Well, you can't write a book about everything.
No, but you've specifically chosen Antidote to Chaos, so why is chaos?
300 lectures online, and I talk plenty about the pathology of order in those lectures.
Okay, but I'm just saying...
I'm a fan of authoritarian strongmen, that's for sure.
Well, that's good, but I do think that the way that you talk about order in the book is something that people will take away from it.
Be specific.
Okay, so let me think. The way that you talk about natural dominance hierarchies and lobsters. Let's get on to the lobsters. Because I think that the thing that people take away from that is male lobsters compete for female lobsters, and that says something about society now, that men need to be dominant in society, because if lobsters do it, then there is something that we can read about humans from
There's nothing in that chapter at all that suggests that the way that men should succeed in human hierarchies is a consequence of the exercise of power. There's not one line in that entire book that claims that, because it's not what I believe. Most human hierarchies, as I already pointed out, are hierarchies of competence, not power.
Okay, so
that's why we don't live in a patriarchal tyranny. And so if you want to be a successful man, then you should be competent. And that will move you up the hierarchy. And that will make you attractive, and for good reason, unless you want an incompetent mate, which is possible and happens, but isn't something that I would recommend. People will sometimes choose an incompetent mate because they're intimidated by competence. And so they'll settle for someone who they don't respect because they feel that they can master them and they won't be intimidated. But it's not a recipe for a happy life, I can tell you that. So there isn't a line in that chapter that talks about power as the proper means of conducting yourself in life. There's not a line in the book, and there's nothing in anything I've ever said that suggests that.
Okay, no,
but it's really important, because people have read this chapter, and they make exactly the argument that you make. And it's a misapprehension. So it's a misapprehension of the book.
Okay, but if so many people are getting the same misapprehension, could it be
There are so
possible?
many people that are getting it. There's 2 million people that have bought the book, and there's a very small handful of people who have a particular ideological perspective who enjoy developing that perspective because it indicates just what sort of reprehensible individual I am. But it has absolutely nothing to do with what I wrote or what I've said or what I believe. I don't believe that our fundamental hierarchies are based on power. I don't believe that the way that you move up our hierarchies is as a consequence of manifesting power. It's competence.
Okay, my big problem with the lobsters is that it's scientifically bollocks. Right? It's just, you cannot read across from lobsters and what they do to what
Of
humans
course
do.
you can. That's why serotonin works on lobsters.
But it works in 2 different ways. So if serotonin makes lobsters more aggressive, it makes
No,
humans
it makes them
less
more dominant.
aggressive. Right? That's
No,
what
that's
happens.
not right.
That
Serotonin makes human beings more dominant but less aggressive. And the only reason it makes them more dominant is because they're less aggressive and they're less defensive and aggressive. So it's not bollocks. I know my neurochemistry. So if you're going to play neurochemistry, let's go and do it.
Okay, well, you say antidepressants work on lobsters.
Yes, they do. They make a lobster that's been defeated in a fight more likely to fight again.
That's not the same mechanism that
It's the
happens
same
in
mechanism.
humans.
Yes,
Because
it is.
lobsters
It's the
don't
same
get
mechanism.
depressed as the way that humans are. I think you're anthropomorphizing into a ridiculous degree. These are
I think
creatures that urinate out of their faces.
I think that the fundamental issue among knowledgeable animal behaviorists is that anthropomorphization of animals is generally the appropriate tactic unless you have reason to doubt it, which is because there's continuity between us and animals rather than discontinuity. And the idea that the anthropomorphization of animals is inappropriate is something derived from 1950s behaviorism. The highly trained affective neuroscientists and people who study motivation and emotion as well as neurochemistry know perfectly well that there is biological and behavioral continuity across the animal kingdom and way down into the kingdom as well, which is exactly why I chose lobsters, to indicate that there is so much continuity in the systems that allow us to estimate a status position that we share it with creatures that are a third of a billion years old. And the reason that I made that argument was to put paid at least in part to the absurd Marxist proposition that hierarchical structures are a secondary consequence of Western civilization and free market economies, which is as preposterous a perspective as you could possibly develop about anything. Hierarchies are a third of a billion years old. You can't blame them on the West or men or capitalism. And we're wired